Okay, so good morning, and let's get right into the fourth lesson from the workbook of A Course in Miracles. And what's interesting is, I had thought about possibly pre-recording this last night so I'd have it up earlier. And when I went to do it, the instruction that came was simple. You're to do one lesson a day. So that applies also to how we're going about this. So I suspended my idea of doing the lesson last night and waited till this morning so I would do one lesson for the day. And what's interesting about this lesson for me is, when I spent a considerable amount of time with a gentleman who was known as the master teacher. And one of the things he would say was that if you read the titles, just the title, for the first 12 lessons, it would sound like a suicide note. And with nothing I see means anything. I've given everything I see all the meaning it has to me. I don't understand anything I see. The thoughts, my thoughts, they don't have any meaning. I'm never upset for the reason I think. I'm upset because I see something that isn't there. I'm seeing only the past. My mind is preoccupied with past thoughts. I see nothing as it is now. My thoughts do not mean anything. My meaningless thoughts are showing me a meaningless world. I'm upset because I see a meaningless world. Well, I think when you read those that way and you understand the fundamental nature of what the workbook is designed to bring about, which is, as I said, in the first half, the undoing of your thinking and your perceptions that are keeping your real thoughts, as it says in this lesson, from dawning on you. The way in which this proceeds is different from the way in which the learning of the world and the transfer of learning of the world proceeds. So, you could take it for an example. If you were to learn something in the world, you would read a manual, tells you how things work, and then you would be given an exercise, and when you follow the directions, it would get done. You would be done. In this, what Jesus is saying, what the author is saying is, it's the exercises, it's in the doing of the exercises themselves, and the experience and the understandings that come. And in the first half of the book, it's the understandings that are being undone, the understandings that are leaving your mind as being fixed points around which your life is organized, are being undone so as to make sense of some of what you had been reading in the text. So it's the exact opposite, so no wonder the first 12 lessons would read as a death knell for the ego, for egoic thinking, because that's what we're setting out to learn, to demonstrate to ourselves the limitations that we operate under when we follow the dictates of thinking that are fostered by the egoic beliefs that we accept as true, necessary, and valid, yet we're finding out are actually detrimental to the realization of the truth of who we are and our pursuit of salvation, miracle-mindedness, awakening, and the recognition that we're perfect as God created us. And there's some indications in this lesson that I'd like to point out that show certain attitudes toward the way we should perceive. And to jump ahead to the bottom, there's a statement that's made, and it says, you could also use the idea for a particular thought that you recognize as harmful. Okay, it's more like an affirmation. This practice is useful, but it is not a substitute for the more random practice, for the more random procedure to be followed for the exercise. Here's the kicker. Do not, however, examine your mind for more than a minute or so. You are too inexperienced as yet to avoid the tendency to become pointlessly preoccupied, once again, with your own thoughts and the rabbit hole that they lead you down. Now, when he makes this statement, it's not being made in any regard to how much of the text you've read, how many times you've read the text, whether you consider yourself a course scholar or not. What he's saying is, on your fourth day of doing these exercises, you are too new in the ways of the workbook, in the manner by which we performed that which is required of us to undo our perception. You're too new in those ways to take much more than a few minutes of this a day, regardless of how much of the text you read, regardless of how many times you've been through the manual for teachers, because it is in the doing of the exercises and the undoing that comes of all of our thoughts, of the way we learn, why we learn, what we're learning, is in the undoing of those that where we begin to get a glimpse of what our real thoughts are. And that's part of the earlier part of this lesson. In selecting subjects for the application of today's idea, the usual specificity is required. Do not be afraid to use good thoughts as well as bad thoughts. None of them represents your real thoughts, which are being covered up by what we consider good or bad thoughts, that are being covered up. Our real thoughts are being covered up by these distracting thoughts that the ego fosters to keep us wandering through this maze of misidentity, misperception, and separation, so as to never get out. So the first 12 lessons, reading as they do, really is the recognition of the inability for egoic thinking to help us and our reactions to that. Many of us feel like pains of wanting to be pulled back into the old thinking simply because we've taken comfort in it before, not because it's really offered us any true comfort, but because we're creatures of habit and we continue to seek for things where they are not rather than where they are. And one of the things that we're getting here is that all these thoughts are covering up our real thoughts, and that's what we're actually seeking for. The real thoughts about who we are that have been given to us and that we share with all of reality. We share with all our kindred brother souls. We share it to Christ's mind. We share with God as creating us. Because it's there where we find our true meaning, within us. So today's lesson, these thoughts do not mean anything. In that sense, they're like everything else we've been looking at. The fireplace that's outside of me and in front of me, the what's on the street. But now we're going within our mind, not just to what's outside of our mind. We're really putting this where it is. My thoughts. These thoughts do not mean anything. And that could be disheartening, especially if you base your reputation and your life and all your achievement on the fact that you've been a thinker and you've been able to accomplish all these things in the world. And now you're finding out that they don't really have any value or any meaning because they're diametrically opposed to your real mission here in life, which is the discovery of your own reality, the discovery of your wholeness and perfection that has been guaranteed by God in your creation and has not been lost. It's just been covered up. So there's another interesting line. He says, do not repeat these exercises more than 3 or 4 times during the day. And that goes back to the idea that an untrained mind can accomplish nothing. And being in the 4th day of the mind training, we haven't had a sufficient enough accumulation of unlearning, a sufficient enough recognition of the meaninglessness of the thoughts that we think throughout the day as being prohibitive of the achievement of what we're here to achieve. And as the Course says, your only real achievement here is salvation. And that comes as we learn to take our part in the plan and in the doing of God's will. So if God's will is buried deep within us, we must remove the interference that keeps us from recognizing what God's will is for us and stop obeying the mandates of the ego as the distractions to the learning of what God's will is for us and the ability to do God's will here in space and time. Let's see. And what he also says is, these thoughts do not mean anything. This is a major exercise. On the 4th day, you're doing a major exercise. And it's going to be repeated from time to time in a somewhat different format, but with the same purpose and the same meaning. The recognition that the thoughts that we think aren't our real thoughts. And as we loosen our mind from the habitual thinking of following the thoughts and the associations of the thoughts to what we think are logical conclusions, we find there's a whole new modus operandi available to us. We can call it miracle-mindedness. And if you've read ahead in the text, you're beginning to understand what's being asked of you, at least conceptually. But remember, what you think is being asked of you conceptually is not the same as having the experience, is not the same as what is actually being asked of you. Because all the ideas that we have about it are still based in past thinking, still based in valuing what has no value. And it's these exercises that are designed to help us free our mind from that type of thinking in every regard, to generalize it, to include everything. So unlike the preceding exercises where you looked out and you began to just say, oh, that table doesn't mean anything, the cup doesn't mean anything, for a moment today you're going to examine your mind. You're going to begin to look at the thoughts that are crossing your mind. And you're not supposed to order them, you're just supposed to let them come for about a minute and see how much of a mixed bag they are, and see the associations that are made in your mind. And then recognize these thoughts really don't mean anything. Nothing I see means anything. I've given everything I see all the meaning it has to me. I do not understand anything I see, and if that's true, then the thoughts don't mean anything. My thoughts really don't mean anything. That doesn't mean I haven't given them meaning. It doesn't mean that the world doesn't verify and validate the meaning that I've given them. It just means that inherently they have no meaning, and they are actually costing me true sight, true vision. And that's, remember, what the goal is. We're going from living a life based on false perception, misunderstandings of who we are and the condition we find ourselves in, to the recognition that there's another life waiting for us that can be had in any moment if we free ourselves from the thoughts that have bound us and kept us from that certainty and understanding. I think the other thing that's important to recognize is there's this whole idea where, oh, you could do one lesson and you could suddenly get it in its entirety. Well, the truth is that you can, at any point in time, be doing the lessons or not be doing the lessons. You can have an experience that shows you everything, that shows you everything you need to know and solves your problem as a seeker. However, without the retraining of your mind, that experience remains an anomaly and doesn't have any true value as you proceed in your sojourn from darkness to light. So, those are just a few things that I wanted to say for today. Remember, if you're having experiences that are showing you your resistance, if you're having experiences that are showing you like the lack of willingness, just use them. These thoughts don't mean anything. They don't have to be prohibitive in the fulfillment of your function. When seen rightly, we can pass them by, and as this says, set aside the judgments just for a moment. Not give them the weight that we've given them in the past to cause us consternation, but allow them to just be thoughts, as any thought is a thought, our own thoughts, so therefore not necessarily important, so not valuable, so capable of being left behind for a second, so as to be replaced with a thought not of our own making, from the unified mind of the Christ that perhaps sheds light on the situation and frees us from some of the habitual thinking that has bound us in the past. So with that, we're going to say amen, and tomorrow we'll take a look at another lesson. Thank you.